In college, I was taught a great number of useless things, but one of the most useful bits of advice I was given was in passing from someone who I would not hesitate to call the best teacher at the school. Only once you know the right way should you do it wrong. That way you will be doing it wrong intentionally rather than because you know no other way. I probably butchered that quote, but I hope the point was clear. Drawing in your own unique style is one of the greatest joys of drawing. But if you want to draw something in a stylized way, it's important to first know how to draw it accurately and correctly, otherwise this style will not be a choice, but a limitation. Does this make sense? Probably not. Am I repeating myself? Almost certainly. But whatever. When it comes to drawing figures, there is without a doubt a correct way they should be drawn. Humans, though they may have their differences, come from a genetic blueprint that builds roughly the same thing every time, and with this, we can know the correct proportions with which to draw a figure. For the longest time, I knew nothing of anatomy and proportions. Every character I drew was a janky, disproportioned, and horrifically malformed Chernobyl abomination because I never learned the right way to draw. But now I have learned to draw correctly, and now my drawings are intentionally grotesque abominations because I learned to do it right. Alternatively, and conveniently for this video, one of the most useless things I learned in school was proportions. Not because knowing proper proportions is useless, but what I was taught was useless. I'm sure every artist watching is familiar with the 7.5 heads. And to every non-artist, it probably sounds like I'm describing a beast from Revelations, but I assure you we're still talking about proportions and art. The 7.5 heads technique, sometimes just the 7 heads or sometimes the 8 heads, is a method of drawing a human figure to the correct proportions. In fact, if you just type human proportions into a search engine, you will no doubt see a couple million pictures showing this and nothing else. Yeah, I paid $30,000 to go to college and learn something that literally anyone could look up online. Feels great. This has led me to believe that this is the only widely accepted technique for drawing proportions. Which does not make any sense to me, because it absolutely sucks. It's by far the most useless technique for drawing proportions I could imagine, and it does nothing to help anyone in the way that they would most likely be drawing. One reason why this method sucks is because if you just look it up online, most of the pictures don't tell you anything about where the heads go. Because where each head begins and ends is actually important, but still not helpful. Let me elaborate. Starting at the top, the first head is obviously from the top of the head to the chin. The second is from the chin to the nipples, then nipples to navel, navel to crotch, and now there's a problem. The fifth head goes from the crotch to somewhere just above the knees. The sixth goes from somewhere just above the knees to some random place on the shin. Then the seventh goes to the ankle, and the half goes from ankle to foot. God help you if you're using just 7 heads or even 8 heads. That probably throws the whole thing out of whack. I think the problem is pretty plain to see. Everything works out perfectly until you're 5 heads in and it's too late to turn back, so you just have to guess your way through the rest. The other major problem is that this technique only works on a figure standing straight upright, facing the camera in an orthographic perspective. If you want an action pose, or to throw some perspective in there, or just do anything other than a straight flat figure, you're a little bit fucked. Also, this method leaves out a lot of important detail, the biggest example being where the arms start and end. Before I had even gone to college, I had actually come up with my own technique for drawing proportions, that not only gives you the same results as the 7.5 heads technique, but is more versatile than it could ever be. Maybe there's another technique that's better, or this technique already exists, but if it does, I have not seen anything about it. So today I thought I'd give a demonstration of my personal technique as well as give my reasoning for why it's superior to the 7.5 heads technique. So without further ado, this is the... I don't actually have a name for this. This is the correspondent proportion system. Sure, why not? There are 4 parts that I will be dividing the figure into for simplicity: the head, torso, legs, and arms. I will be approaching them in that order, as that is usually the order I draw them in. Also, everything won't be perfectly accurate. This isn't an exact science. All of these measurements were derived from simple observation. An interesting thing to note is that, with a few minor exceptions, male and female proportions are really almost identical. I'll call out these differences when they appear, but for the most part the steps remain the same regardless of the gender of your figure. Additionally, I should mention that this is an overly refined version of this technique, so I'm going to be going into excessive amounts of detail here. If you want a more concise explanation, I'll be going into that at the end. If you want to skip to that, or any particular part of the body, there are timestamps in the description. The head section I'm going to classify as both the head and the neck down to the clavicle. To start with, draw a head of any size you want. Keep in mind that the head is not just a circle, so you need to add a bit to the bottom. I'm not going to go too much into the specifics of drawing the head because that has so many of its own rules. I feel like that could be an entire video in and of itself, if that's something that people are interested in. So once you've drawn the head, the neck is next. The neck is actually pretty close to the width of the head. I realize this doesn't help much since I said I wouldn't go into more detail on the head, but the neck is roughly the width between the outer corners of the eyes or the temporal ridges. I know it's not the most useful, but that's just the way it is, so just go with slightly narrower than the widest point of the head. The length of the neck should be half the height of the head from chin to clavicle. This length is actually the same on the back and sides of the neck, only from the trapezius to the base of the skull. Now, the next step is slightly different depending on the gender of your character. The trapezius muscles on a male are larger than those of a female. On a male character, they are pretty much a straight line from the shoulders to a point roughly level with the chin. Females, on the other hand, have much shallower trapezius. They are pretty much just a straight line, level with the shoulders, only rising up with the natural curve with which the muscles connect to the neck. Now, obviously, this isn't necessarily the case for all characters. Muscularity, weight, and stylization are going to change these for both genders, but for this example, I'm going with the standard anatomy. No exceptions or personal preferences. The next step is the torso. The torso will be from the clavicle to the base of the pelvis, arms not included. Starting with the clavicle, if you're drawing a male character, it's more standard for the clavicle to extend past the hips, while on the female they are fairly in line with them. But since we haven't gotten to the hips yet, you can adjust later when we get to the arms at the end. The exact shape of the clavicle isn't too important either because it changes from person to person. Be sure to make a notch in the center where the two clavicles connect to the ribcage. Now, continuing down to the ribcage is actually pretty square. At its widest and longest point, it's roughly twice the width of the head. Tapering up from the center point, the ribcage is about the width of the neck where it meets the clavicle. The sharpness with which this taper transitions is up to you, though it's not entirely necessary since this part will not be visible once you add the pectoral muscles. Speaking of which, I'm actually going to be leaving the pectorals out for the moment because they are more important when drawing the arms than with the torso. The most I'll do at this point is just a center line for reference. Alternatively, the bottom of the rib cage will be visible. The taper from the center to the base, I'll leave up to you as well. I've seen pictures of rib cages that taper in sharply, some more shallow, and some that don't seem to taper at all. So I'll let you decide what yours looks like. Also in line with the center point of the rib cage is the peak of the costal arch, which then tapers down to the base of the rib cage, meeting with the previously drawn tapers. I'm not going to go into the exact shape of this arch either, because there are too many possible shapes to go into, so just draw whatever shape of arch you prefer. Now, the abdominal region. From the base of the rib cage to the base of the pelvis is roughly the same length as the rib cage. Next is the pelvic bone, or more specifically, the iliac crest. The part of this bone that will be visible is located below the ribcage and is conveniently also the same length as both the ribcage and abdomen, only this time it starts at the peak of the costal arch. Next, just draw the lines coming down from the iliac crest to the base of the pelvis. I'll leave this shape up to you again because, like the costal arch, it varies widely. Now returning to the waist. Its width is different between male and female characters. In most cases, females have narrower waists, starting closer to the base of the rib cage, while on males, this line generally goes straight down, with only a slight taper. Also, while we're coming off the iliac crest, the navel is located roughly level with the top of it. Now, just like the waist, the hips are different on males and females, but probably not where you'd think it would be. While it's true that the pelvic bone is shaped differently between the genders, this isn't really where the difference is apparent. The internal structure of the female pelvic bone is wider and more open, but this isn't something that's really noticeable from the exterior. It's actually more the legs where this difference comes in, and conveniently that's where we're going next. Now the legs. The legs are actually the longest section of the body. This works in our favor because we've already got a reference point made. The legs are twice as long as the torso from clavicle to the base of the pelvis, and both sections are roughly the same length, though the lower leg includes the feet in this length. Now beginning with the thigh, this section begins at the top of the iliac crest and ends at the center of the knee. The inner thigh, for the most part, is fairly straight, though there is a muscle group halfway up that bulges out more than the rest. For the outer thigh, we'll have to get into some gender differences. Now, as previously mentioned, females appear to have wider hips, but in reality, it's actually the thighs, more specifically the femurs, that are responsible for this. The femurs are set wider in the pelvis and also lean out more, whereas male femurs are more vertical. This results in the top of the thigh sticking out past the hips. However, on males, the thigh only widens slightly, but remain fairly straight, all things considered, though they do taper to the knee where the leg is narrower, though muscularity affects this. Unfortunately, I don't really have a measurement for how much narrower the knees are, because the difference is so slight that to find an exact width would almost be getting too nitpicky, so just taper them slightly before widening out for the lower leg. Again, there are gender differences here. Like the thighs, the inner lower leg is roughly straight, with the exception of the calf muscle at the top. On males, this muscle is larger than on females, but on both, they should stick out no more than the inner thigh. The outer side of the calf is about equal to the one on the inner side, the only difference being that this muscle tapers down to the base of the leg rather than stopping halfway down, like the inner one. Also, the thinnest part of the lower leg should be the same width as the knee. Now the feet. Feet have always been the bane of my existence. I've had more issues drawing feet than I have drawing hands or any other part of the body, so I'm going to try to blast through this. First of all, there are two little bones sticking out from the bottom of the leg called the medial malleolus and the lateral malleolus. The one on the inner side of the ankle is higher than the outer one. The shape of the feet is a rough triangle, with their base being about equal with the width of the calves. I don't actually have a measurement for their height, but it's not that high, so just do this. Toes, there are 5 per foot, and they go about halfway up their height. There we go. Feet done. Moving to arms. It probably seems a bit odd to save the arms for last, but that's because the legs are needed for reference markers. It's important to mention that the arms do not float independently of the body. I've seen more than a couple designs in which the arms are not properly attached and instead sitting somewhere off to the side. Instead, the arms are connected to the torso at a bit of an angle, the top of which is located at the end of the clavicle. Now, before we continue, we need to go back to the chest briefly, as I said we would. First thing to mention is that the pecs don't connect in the middle. Instead, they are set on either side of the sternum, which is roughly the same width as the jugular notch, or the space between the two clavicles. The pecs then stop at the top of the costal arch. Now, returning to the arms, like the legs, both the upper and forearm are roughly equal lengths. that length being the same as the ribcage. So that means, in this resting position, the elbow should be level with the base of the ribcage. The deltoid muscle at the top of the arm sticks out more than the rest of the arm does, and goes down to the same height as the bottom of the pectoral. Next, the pectoral is connected to the deltoid at roughly the center point of the sternum, and while I won't get too much into muscularity because most of these muscles you will not see unless you have a muscular character, I'll make an exception to point out that the bicep connects underneath the pectoral. Now, the width of the arm fluctuates as you go down, but overall it's roughly half that of the leg. And when I say the leg, I'm using the male character as reference. As mentioned above in the leg section, females generally have thighs that stick out more, so I'm referring to it from the inner leg to directly down from the hip. Back to the arms. The upper arm is narrower than the deltoid and goes down to the base of the ribcage as previously mentioned. At the elbow, the bicep muscles taper in to fit between those of the forearm. Before we get to the actual muscles of the forearm, we should start with the length. Since both sections of the arm are the same length and the upper arm ends at the base of the ribcage, that means the wrist has to be level with the base of the pelvis. The wrist will also be the narrowest part of the arm, regardless of which way it's turned. Alternatively, the widest part of the arm is where the forearm meets the elbow, where we had the bicep taper. From that point down to roughly the height of the iliac crest, both sides of the forearm bulge out. However, on the outer side, instead of coming back in, the muscle extends down to the wrist in a fairly straight line. Meanwhile, on the inner arm, while this is not necessarily anatomically accurate, to get the shape right, draw the inner muscle as if it would connect to the outer wrist, creating a teardrop shape. Then connect the inner wrist to the outer point where the forearm and bicep meet. Some of these lines will need to be erased, but that's how you get the shape. Next is the hand, but unfortunately, like the head, I won't be able to go into too much detail with the hands because I just don't have the time to get into that whole thing in this video. The least I'll say is that with the fingers in a relaxed position, the hand goes down to the mid-thigh. Also, the fingers are equal in length to the body of the hand. That's really all I can get into without going on a 10-minute tangent, so instead we're going to move on. The last difference here between male and female characters is that females have breasts. They're actually really simple to draw. Just make 2 circles of your preferred size, place them atop the pecs, take gravity into account, and connect them to the clavicular head, which itself connects from where the deltoid and pectoral meet to the center of the clavicle. That's all there is to it. And that's all there is to this demonstration. That's how you draw a figure using my correspondent proportion system. It's important to note that not all of these steps need to be followed to the letter, and a majority of them I had to actually figure out just for the sake of this video. Many of them, I realized while writing the script, do the exact same thing I criticized the 7.5 heads method for doing, which is being only useful for flat orthographic images without any posing or perspective. But at the very least, I think I gave more relevant information than just stack heads and figure it out yourself, you scrub. I only follow a few of these steps in my own drawings, as well as a few alternative, simplified ones. The most important steps to keep in mind that I use all the time are that the head should be able to fit inside the rib cage, both sections of the arm are the same length as the rib cage, and both sections of the leg are equal to the entire torso. That's really all you need to keep in mind. Plus, these are the most relevant steps for drawing your figure in different poses and positions, as I am demonstrating now. I realize I didn't give any information on drawing a character from the back, but honestly this video is already way too long as it is, and I gave a truly ridiculous amount of possibly useless information on just the front alone, so I don't think I will be able to cover the back here. Also, I haven't come up with quite as in-depth a method for the back proportions, but if for some reason people want to see me ramble endlessly about drawing in another video, let me know. It was fun drawing for this, and it required almost no editing, so it was far easier than anything with animation in it. Other than that, I hope this video was informative. If this helped anyone, or if anyone has their own method of figuring out proper proportions, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If there's one further bit of information I can give, it's to look up anatomical diagrams. That's how I got to where I am now. Just study skeletal and muscular diagrams, learn how everything connects, what muscles are visible from the surface, what goes over, what goes under, all of that. I honestly cannot express how much constant study of anatomy has improved my drawings over the years, and would greatly encourage everyone to do the same. Next week's video will actually relate to this quite a bit, and cover things that I think are very important when discussing anatomy and proportions. Don't worry, I swear it will be shorter than this monstrosity of a video. Probably. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please press all the buttons and follow me in all the places. I hope to see you next time, but until then, good night.